The events of the cardiac cycle need to be coordinated so that the atria contract first, followed by the ventricles, and then we have diastole to allow the heart to fill with blood again. The coordination of the cardiac cycle is managed by the cardiac conduction system. Now, the heart itself is what we call autorhythmic. It generates its own rhythm. Your heart will beat without any input from your brain as long as it has adequate oxygen. But we need a way to spread the signal through the heart that's going to coordinate it so that we get the proper cardiac cycle. The cardiac conduction system is a set of specialized cells that initiate and spread the signal to contract. To get a better idea of how the cardiac conduction system is able to coordinate the events of the cardiac cycle, we need to take a closer look at the components of the cardiac conduction system. We start with a patch of specialized cells in the right atrium called the SA node, or the sinoatrial node. The SA node is the pacemaker of the heart. It contains a patch of special cells that depolarize or change their membrane potential regularly. If there were no input from your brain at all, these cells would depolarize at the rate of about 100 times per minute. But we do have some input from the parasympathetic nervous system that lowers that so that the average heart rate is more along the lines of about 75 beats per minute. And this is, again, started by the cells in the sinoatrial node, the SA node, that change their membrane potential automatically without any help from anything else. When they change their membrane potential, that's the signal to contract. That signal is going to spread through both of the atria through the gap junctions between the cells. So once the SA node cells change their membrane potential, that's the signal to contract. The signal spreads through gap junctions to all the cells of the atria, so the atria contract. The atria and the ventricles aren't connected by gap junctions, so the signal from the atria is not automatically going to spread to the ventricles. Instead, it has to go to the second part of the cardiac conduction system, which is called the AV node. At the AV node, we pause for a moment. The AV node is sort of like a delay mechanism. It slows down the signal coming from the atria, so there's time for the atria to contract first before the signal gets passed on to the ventricles. Once we've had a little delay in the SA node, then the signal spreads to what we call the AV bundle. The AV bundle are specialized cells that carry the signal to the ventricles, and they are right here, sort of at the top of the interventricular septum. The AV bundle divides into left and right bundle branches that come down the interventricular septum to the apex of the heart. Once we reach the apex of the heart, then the signal spreads upward through the walls of the ventricles through what are called the Purkinje fibers. This is going to send the signal to all the cells of the ventricle so all the cells of the ventricle can contract at the same time. It might be a little bit easier to see this in an animated format so you can see how the signal is spreading and how the atria and ventricles are contracting. So here is a brief animation to show that. We'll see the signal is going to start up in the right atrium. Right here, there's the signal in the SA node spreading to both atria so they contract. The signal delays at the AV node, then spreads down the AV bundle to the apex and up the Purkinje fibers so that the ventricles contract. Let's see this in a little bit closer to real time. Here's the same animation, only speeded up so it's closer to the speed of a regular heartbeat. We can see the atria contract first, delay, then ventricles contract. Atria contract, delay, ventricles contract. And you can see from the red lines how the electrical signal is spreading through the heart to coordinate these events of the cardiac cycle. Because the signals of the cardiac conduction system that tell the heart when to contract are electrical signals, we can measure them. We can measure the electrical activity of the heart using an ECG, or electrocardiogram. The pattern of an ECG can vary depending on exactly where leads are attached to measure the electrical activity of the heart, but a typical ECG pattern looks like the one shown. We have a little bump up, a little dip down, a spike up, back down, and then another little bump. Each little movement up or down from baseline on the ECG is labeled with a letter. So our first bump up is P, down to Q, spike up to R, down to S, and a little bump for T. The segments of this ECG pattern are telling us what's happening electrically in the heart. If we start at the beginning, the first bump we see here is called the P wave. The P wave is showing us the depolarization of the atria. So when the atria depolarize, change their membrane potential, they're not quite contracting yet, they're just depolarizing. We see the change in electrical activity, that's the P wave. The next segment of the ECG is called the PQ segment. During the PQ segment, the signal is being delayed at the AV node. That's why we don't really see much activity. There's a delay in the signal at the AV node. During this time, the atria are able to contract. Once the atria have contracted, we can see the signal is moving again. We get what's called the QRS complex. During the QRS complex, the signal to contract is spreading through the ventricles. It's going down the AV bundle, through the right and left bundle branches, and then up the Purkinje fibers to depolarize the ventricles so that they will be able to contract in a moment. At the same time the ventricles are depolarizing, our atria are repolarizing or going back to their normal membrane potential. The ventricles don't actually contract during the QRS complex. That happens during the next segment. The next segment of the ECG is the ST segment. During this time, the ventricles are contracting. They're actually pushing the blood out. And then we get finally to the T wave. During the T wave, the ventricles repolarize or go back to their normal resting membrane potential. To be able to see how this ECG pattern matches with the activity of the cardiac conduction system, we have this animation. You can see the SA node signal spreading through the atria, that's the P wave. Now we have a delay at the AV node, then the QRS complex, and then the T wave. So to see it again, the SA node signal spreads to the atria during the P wave. We have a pause during the PQ complex while the atria contract. Then the QRS complex as the signal spreads through the ventricles, so the ventricles can contract during the ST segment, and then the T wave where the ventricles repolarize again. The really helpful thing about an ECG is that it's a non-invasive test. It's very easy to just put leads on the outside of somebody's body and measure the electrical activity of the heart, and yet it can provide some really valuable information about what might be going wrong with the heart. So if you were to just listen to the heart, you might be able to hear an irregular heartbeat, but you wouldn't have an idea of what's going on electrically. The ECG can help with that.